Before there was a garden, before there was a serpent, before a single word was spoken to Eve, something had already gone wrong. The Bible never opens with the story of a war. It opens with the results of one. An enemy already fallen, already waiting, already coiled in the grass by the time Genesis begins its very first chapter. No introduction, no backstory, no explanation of how a serpent, capable of speech, capable of deception, capable of undoing an entire creation, came to be standing in a garden described, just verses earlier, as entirely good. So here is the question almost no one asks out loud. What happened before Genesis 1? Where was this enemy before he was a serpent? What was he before he was an accusation? And why does Scripture, across 1,000 years of writing by dozens of different authors, seem to assume its readers already know the answer and simply refuses to spell it out? Scattered across Scripture, in a taunt against a Babylonian king, in a lament for a Phoenician ruler, in a strange verse about the sons of God, in a vision on the island of Patmos centuries later, are fragments. Pieces of a story never told in full, never narrated start to finish, as if the authors assumed their readers already carried the shape of it in memory and only needed reminding of the edges. Tonight, we gather those fragments, not to invent what Scripture doesn't say, but to understand, as carefully and honestly as the evidence allows, what it does. We are not going to tell you tonight that the Bible contains a hidden chapter, deleted by ancient councils or suppressed by early church authorities. It doesn't, and claiming otherwise would not be honest history, however dramatic it might sound. What we are going to do instead is trace, text by careful text, how the earliest Jewish and Christian communities understood the origin of evil in a universe their own Scripture insists was created entirely good, without flaw, without shadow. We will look at the oldest layers of ancient Near Eastern conflict imagery. We will examine prophetic taunts against human kings that later generations reread as something far larger than politics. We will study the strange, elaborate visions found in Jewish writings outside the Bible, which shaped how Second Temple Judaism imagined the unseen heavens. And we will end with the Book of Revelation's own 5-verse vision of an actual war fought in the sky. By the end, you will understand not a secret war invented purely for drama, but the real, textured, centuries-long process by which a single ancient question, where does evil come from, produced one of the most influential stories Scripture never fully wrote down. To understand why later readers went looking for a war in heaven, we first need to understand the world that produced the Hebrew Scriptures in the first place. The ancient Near East, the world surrounding early Israel, was crowded with divine conflict stories. Babylonian religion told of the god Marduk battling the chaos goddess Tiamat before creation could properly begin, splitting her body to form heaven and earth. Canaanite mythology, known to us largely through tablets discovered at the ancient city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast in the 20th century, told of the storm god Baal battling Yam, the god of the unruly sea, and later Mot, the god of death itself, in a cyclical struggle tied to the seasons. Ancient Israel emerged inside this crowded mythological world, and its own scriptures respond to it directly, deliberately, and distinctively. Genesis opens not with a battle between rival gods, but with a single, calm, entirely authoritative voice, speaking order into formlessness, requiring no struggle, no rival, no combat. Many scholars see this as a deliberate theological contrast, where neighboring religions needed divine warfare to explain the origins of an ordered world, Israel's scripture insists its God required no rival to overcome, no battle to win. Order simply comes because God speaks. And yet, echoes of older conflict language remain, tucked into the poetry. The Hebrew Bible occasionally references a chaos monster called Leviathan, or Rahab, said to be defeated by God in some primeval, half-remembered past, appearing in poetic texts like Psalm 74 and Isaiah 51. These are not full narratives with beginnings and endings. They are fragments, the same kind of tantalizing fragments that would later fuel centuries of questions about a war in heaven. By the time we reach the era of the classical prophets and later the Second Temple period, the several centuries stretching between the return from Babylonian exile and the time of Jesus, Jewish thought had developed an increasingly detailed and populated picture of a heavenly realm. The courts of angelic beings surrounding a divine throne, a divine council that appears in texts like Job and the Psalms, and increasingly, over time, the emerging figure of a distinct heavenly adversary, an accuser, a tempter. This is the layered, textured world that would eventually read old prophetic poetry in a startling, expanded new way. It's worth pausing on that phrase, divine counsel, a moment longer, because it is not a modern scholarly invention imposed onto the text from outside. Passages like Psalm 82 open with the striking line that God stands in the assembly of gods, or El, rendering judgment in the midst of divine beings, language that reflects a genuinely ancient conception of a heavenly court, with God enthroned at its center, surrounded by lesser heavenly beings who carry out his will, deliver messages, and, on occasion, in texts like the opening of the book of Job, even bring accusations. One of these figures in Job is called simply the Satan, not yet a proper name in this earliest usage, but a title meaning something closer to the accuser or the adversary, a prosecutorial role within that heavenly court, testing the sincerity of human faithfulness. Only later, across the span of centuries, would this title gradually solidify into the proper name most readers recognize today. Watching that shift happen, slowly, text by text, is itself part of how we can responsibly trace where the fuller tradition of a heavenly rebellion eventually came from. The most famous fragment in this entire tradition begins, strangely enough, as an insult aimed squarely at a human being. In Isaiah chapter 14, the prophet delivers a taunt song against the king of Babylon, mocking his sudden and total downfall in vivid, mythic, almost theatrical language, meant to be sung or chanted with real relish by a people who had suffered under Babylonian power. The text describes a figure once called Day Star Son of Dawn, in later Latin translation, Lucifer, meaning literally light bringer or morning star, who said in his heart that he would ascend above the stars of God, that he would sit enthroned on the Mount of Assembly, that he would make himself like the Most High. And the text declares, with evident satisfaction, that instead of ascending, he is brought down to the depths, down to the very pit. Read carefully in its original historical context. Most scholars agree this passage is fundamentally about an actual, historical Babylonian ruler, using poetic, mythic imagery common throughout the ancient world to describe a tyrant's arrogance and his eventual humiliating downfall, not, originally, a literal description of a rebellious angel. But here is the turn. the moment where the fragment begins to grow beyond its original frame. By the time of the Second Temple period, some Jewish readers, and later, prominently, early Christian writers, began reading this taunt typologically, not replacing its original historical meaning, but layering a second meaning directly on top of it, that the language of prideful ascent and catastrophic collapse described something bigger than any single Babylonian king, however cruel, that it echoed, or perhaps had even originally described, a rebellion among heavenly beings themselves, of which the earthly king's fall was merely one more example, one more instance of an ancient pattern repeating itself in human history. A closely related pattern appears in Ezekiel chapter 28, in a lament this time over the king of Tyre, a wealthy Phoenician port city famous for its trade and its pride. The passage describes a figure who was once, remarkably, in Eden, the very garden of God, covered head to foot in precious stones, described as blameless from the day he was created, until unrighteousness was found in him, and he was violently cast down from the mountain of God, driven out by a guardian cherub. Two ancient laments, two human historical kings, and two texts that later generations of readers would come to see as pointing towards something else entirely, clues to a story Scripture never tells directly, only gestures toward, again and again, from different angles in different centuries. But this raises a deeper question, one worth sitting with. If these texts were originally, straightforwardly about human kings, why did an entire tradition, spanning centuries and multiple religious communities, grow up around reading them as something far more than that? The answer lies partly outside the Bible altogether, in a body of Jewish writing from the Second Temple period that never made it into the Hebrew canon, but that profoundly, undeniably shaped how many ancient readers imagined the unseen world above them. Chief among these is a work called 1 Enoch, a substantial collection of visionary texts, likely composed by multiple authors across several centuries before Christ, attributed to the mysterious biblical figure Enoch, who, according to Genesis, walked with God and did not die in the ordinary way. It survives complete only in the Ethiopian biblical canon today, but crucial fragments of it were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls in the caves near Qumran, confirming decisively that it was known, copied, and genuinely valued by at least some Jewish communities living around the time of Jesus. 1 Enoch dramatically expands a strange, brief, almost throwaway passage in Genesis chapter 6, the account of the sons of God, who saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and took wives from among them, producing offspring the text calls the Nephilim. Genesis gives us only 2 verses on this. 1 Enoch gives us an entire elaborate mythology in response, named angelic leaders, forbidden knowledge taught directly to humanity, corrupted and violent offspring, and ultimately a decisive divine judgment and imprisonment for the rebellious heavenly beings involved. It's crucial to be precise here and not to overstate the case. 1 Enoch was not treated as scripture by the rabbinic Jewish tradition that developed after the Second Temple period, and it is not part of the accepted biblical canon for most Christian traditions either, East or West. But its influence is genuinely undeniable. The New Testament letter of Jude directly quotes it by name, attributing a prophecy explicitly to Enoch, and early Christian writers across several centuries debated its proper status seriously, at length, without ever fully reaching consensus. What 1 Enoch reveals is not a suppressed biblical truth hidden from ordinary believers. It reveals something historically more interesting and in its own way more human, that ancient Jewish communities were actively, seriously wrestling with the same question we are wrestling with tonight. Where did evil, rebellion, and corruption in the unseen world actually come from? And some of those communities produced entire literary traditions to answer it, running alongside, but never quite inside, their official scripture. And that wrestling did not end with Enoch's visions. It found its way, centuries later, into a very different kind of vision, on a small, isolated island in the Aegean Sea. Before we move there, though, it's worth noting how specific and vivid 1 Enoch's own account actually gets, because the detail matters for understanding why it resonated so strongly with later readers. The text names its rebellious leader Azazel and describes 200 angelic beings called Watchers descending together to a mountain traditionally identified with Mount Hermon, binding themselves by mutual oath to take human wives in direct violation of the created order. It describes these beings teaching humanity forbidden knowledge, the making of weapons, the crafting of jewelry, the casting of spells, the reading of omens in the stars, framing the arrival of this knowledge ahead of its proper time as a direct cause of the violence and corruption that in this telling eventually necessitated the flood. Whatever one makes of it theologically, it is a carefully constructed narrative with named characters, specific causes, and specific consequences, precisely the kind of narrative detail the 2 verses in Genesis 6 conspicuously withhold. We arrive now at the only passage anywhere in the Bible that describes, directly and explicitly, something resembling an actual war fought in heaven. Revelation chapter 12, written by a man named John, likely composing this text from a place of exile on the island of Patmos, near the very end of the 1st century, during a period of real and growing tension between the early church and Roman imperial power. The vision itself is strange, deliberately layered, and richly, intentionally symbolic. A woman clothed with the sun, standing on the moon, wearing a crown of 12 stars, and a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, waiting hungrily to devour her newborn child the instant he is born. And then, abruptly, without extensive setup, this: war breaks out in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting directly against the dragon, and the dragon and his own angels fighting fiercely back. And the dragon, the text tells us plainly, does not prevail. He and his angels are defeated and thrown down bodily to the earth. The great dragon, the passage clarifies immediately, is that ancient serpent called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world, hurled down along with his angels. This is the closest thing Scripture anywhere gives us to an actual, described battle scene involving Satan directly. And even here, notably, the passage is famously compressed, almost rushed, a mere 5 verses covering what could easily be an entire extended war narrative, told with the brisk pace of a summary rather than the detail of a narrative. Scholars generally read Revelation 12 as intensely, deliberately symbolic, tied closely to the persecution the early church was actually experiencing under Roman power at the exact time John was writing. The dragon representing not only abstract cosmic evil in general, but the very real, immediate imperial violence John's own community was facing on the ground. That symbolic reading does not make the passage less profound or less serious. It means its author was doing something the entire book of Revelation does consistently, from beginning to end, using cosmic, mythic, larger-than-life imagery to describe a conflict that was, simultaneously, both deeply spiritual and painfully, immediately historical. And notice something else, easy to miss on a quick reading. Revelation never actually tells us precisely when this war happened. Before creation itself? Before the events in the garden? During the earthly ministry of Jesus, which the passage's own surrounding imagery seems to closely echo, given the child the dragon seeks to devour. The text simply doesn't say, "on this point." It shows us only the outcome, a defeated dragon, violently hurled down, described as filled with great fury, because his remaining time, the text says, is now short. The battle itself, even in its one direct, explicit biblical appearance, remains mostly hidden from view. There is one more fragment worth placing carefully into this picture. A single striking sentence, spoken by Jesus himself, recorded in the Gospel of Luke, easy to read past quickly without noticing its full weight. His disciples returned from a mission trip, genuinely amazed and excited that even demons submitted to them when they used his name. And Jesus responds with a sentence that has intrigued and divided careful readers for 2,000 years. "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven." Scholars debate this brief line intensely and honestly. Some read it as Jesus describing a vision of a primordial, prehistorical fall, witnessed somehow outside of ordinary time. Others read it as Jesus describing, in real time, the immediate spiritual significance of his disciples' successful ministry in the present moment. Evil visibly losing ground, both symbolically and genuinely, as the kingdom he proclaimed began actively pushing back against it. The underlying Greek verb tense used here is genuinely grammatically ambiguous, and honest, careful scholarship acknowledges that real ambiguity, rather than resolving it artificially in either direction to fit a preferred theory. What is not ambiguous, however, is the specific imagery Jesus chose to use in that moment, falling like lightning from heaven. The same vertical, catastrophic collapse described in Isaiah's taunt against the king of Babylon. The same downward, violent motion described in Ezekiel's lament for the king of Tyre. The same ultimate defeat described in John's later vision on the island of Patmos. 4 separate texts, centuries apart from one another, different literary genres, different individual authors, different original historical purposes entirely. And yet, the same underlying shape, appearing again and again, almost like a recurring signature, a being of remarkable position and glory, undone specifically by pride, cast down forcefully from the height it once confidently occupied. That consistent repetition is not by itself proof of a single hidden narrative Scripture is secretly telling in code. But it is genuine evidence of something almost as remarkable in its own right. A conviction, held consistently across more than 1,000 years of Israelite and early Christian writing by many different hands, that evil is not eternal, is not equal in power to good, and is not, ultimately, victorious in the end. That whatever the rebellion actually was, wherever and whenever it truly began, it ends the same essential way every single time it appears anywhere in Scripture: falling. It's also worth noting where, narratively, Jesus' statement falls within Luke's Gospel, because placement matters here. It comes immediately after his disciples' first successful mission of healing and exorcism, sent out in pairs to towns Jesus himself had not yet visited. Whatever the precise timing of the vision Jesus describes, the statement functions within Luke's narrative as a kind of theological commentary on what the disciples had just experienced firsthand, framing their ordinary, small-scale acts of healing and deliverance as meaningfully connected to something far larger, a cosmic reversal already underway, rather than as isolated incidents. That connection between small human acts of faithfulness and a much larger unseen conflict is a thread that runs through nearly every fragment we've examined tonight, from the taunts against ancient kings, to the watchers bound in darkness, to the dragon thrown down from the sky. The scale keeps shifting, but the underlying claim stays remarkably consistent. What looks small and local from the ground is, in each of these texts, quietly tied to something enormous happening above it. So what do we actually have in hand, once all of these scattered fragments are finally laid carefully side by side, in order? Not a suppressed chapter, hidden by some ancient authority, not a lost gospel, waiting to be rediscovered, not a full war-narrated scene by dramatic scene, the way a modern film might tell it. We have something more honest, and in its own quiet way, more genuinely compelling, a scriptural tradition that consistently, deliberately refuses to dwell at length on evil's precise origin story, and just as consistently insists, instead, on evil's ultimate and certain defeat. Genesis begins with a serpent already present in the garden, offering no villain origin narrative at all. Isaiah and Ezekiel reach for fallen human kings, not detailed cosmic battle scenes, to voice essentially the same timeless warning about the dangers of pride. 1 Enoch, sitting outside the biblical canon proper, tried earnestly to fill that persistent silence with an elaborate, detailed mythology of its own, and the mainstream Jewish and Christian tradition, after real debate, largely declined to follow it fully into official scripture. Revelation gives us just 5 compressed verses of actual war, and then spends considerably more space describing what comes immediately after the dragon falls than on the fight itself. Across every single one of these very different texts, spanning many centuries, the actual mechanics of the battle are treated as almost beside the point. What matters, again and again, consistently, is the outcome, a being of undeniably great power, refusing to remain in its proper place, is decisively brought low, and the world it threatens is, in the end, genuinely protected. Perhaps that is the real, underlying reason the Bible only ever hints at this war, rather than narrating it in full, satisfying, cinematic detail. Not because the fuller story was hidden away, waiting to be found by the right reader, but because Scripture itself, from Genesis all the way through to Revelation, was never actually all that interested in glorifying the war for its own sake. It was interested, consistently and deliberately, in the God who ends it. There's a further pattern worth naming before we close, because it appears in every single fragment we've traced tonight, without exception. In each case, the Babylonian king in Isaiah, the king of Tyre in Ezekiel, the Watchers in 1 Enoch, the dragon in Revelation, the defeat is never described as a close contest, an uncertain struggle whose outcome hangs genuinely in doubt. It is always described as already, effectively decided, almost before the narrative reaches its climax. The king's fall is announced with mocking confidence before it fully happens. The Watchers are judged and bound with barely a hint of resistance recorded. The dragon in Revelation loses the war in a single verse, with no extended battle sequence at all. This is a deliberate literary and theological choice, repeated across many centuries and many authors, and it tells us something important about how these ancient communities understood the nature of the conflict itself, not as an evenly matched struggle between two comparable powers, but as a rebellion whose outcome was never genuinely uncertain to begin with, however dramatic and costly it appeared from the ground. We began tonight by asking what happened before Genesis chapter 1, before the serpent ever entered the garden, before evil in this story even had a proper name attached to it. We end somewhere quieter, and in some ways more difficult, with an answer Scripture gives only sideways, only in scattered fragments, spread across roughly 1,000 years of continuous writing by many different hands, in many different genres, that the precise origin of the conflict matters, in the end, considerably less than the response to it. Every tradition that inherited these texts, Jewish, Christian, and the many communities and conversations standing somewhere between them, has had to sit, eventually, with the same deliberate restraint the Bible itself consistently practices on this subject. A war is mentioned, briefly. A fall is described, vividly but quickly. A dragon is thrown down, decisively. And then, deliberately, every single time, the text moves on, toward a garden, toward a covenant, toward a manger in Bethlehem, toward an empty tomb outside Jerusalem. Perhaps the silence surrounding the war in heaven is not, in the end, an absence of important information that history simply lost or the church deliberately suppressed. Perhaps it is Scripture's oldest, most consistent, and most quietly confident argument of all, that however real the ancient conflict truly was, however old the original rebellion, the very last word was never actually going to belong to the one who fell.